If we're concerned, I'm concerned about the future of where our country is headed. I'm only going to be here the next 20, 30 years probably. I'm looking out for the future. What's Hunter's life's going to be like? What is the world going to be like? What are we going to treat people like? How are we going to interact? How do we communicate? How do we teach our children? That's the biggest issue right now. I think conflict resolution needs to be taught in school to kids. I don't think in today's world there are too many opportunities for conflicts that can arise, and they don't have the mental capacity yet to understand how to de-escalate. The whole thing.
I hear what you're saying.
Could have been avoided.
I hear what you're saying, and
I could tell both of them. Austin could have walked away. Carmelo could have walked away. But that's not what happened.
I hear it. I hear it, and you're right. That's not what happened. And we're here, and you're dealing with it best you can, and I appreciate your perspective on this. If there's anything we can do, we're a call away.
Welcome to Noir Case Files, where we uncover the stories that still leave people searching for answers. From chilling investigations to the hidden details many missed, each case takes you deeper into the darkness behind the headlines. If you're drawn to true crime, unsolved mysteries, and shocking twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the cases everyone's talking about. Now, let's step into tonight's case. The pouring rain on April 2nd, 2025, did more than just delay a high school track meet at David Kuykendall Stadium in Frisco, Texas. It forced two completely different worlds into a confined high-tension space, setting off a chain reaction that ended the life of 17-year-old Austin Metcalf. For his father, the devastating loss of his son, an MVP football player with a bright future, was not just a tragedy born of a random, chaotic moment. It was a failure of structure, security, and situational intervention. In the agonizing days, weeks, and months that followed the fatal stabbing, and as the case pushed through a high-profile murder trial in Collin County, Austin's father consistently pointed to specific, actionable gaps where the trajectory of that afternoon could have been permanently altered. To understand his perspective on how this death could have been prevented, one must look closely at the environment of the stadium that day, the rules governing student-athletes during severe weather delays, and the glaring absence of adult oversight at the exact moment a verbal dispute turned lethal. The defense and prosecution would later spend days in a courtroom debating the legal definitions of self-defense, provocation, and sudden passion. But for a grieving father, the true failure occurred long before a knife was pulled from a backpack. On that stormy afternoon, heavy downpours created immediate logistical confusion. Dozens of students from different schools were left to find immediate shelter, leading to a crowded, unmonitored environment. Austin Metcalf was inside his own school's team tent, a designated safe space for the Frisco Memorial High School athletes. When Carmelo Anthony, a student from rival Frisco Centennial High School, entered the same tent to escape the rain, the atmospheric tension matched the storm outside. The subsequent verbal altercation lasted roughly 2 minutes, a critical window of time where the presence of a single coach, athletic director, or stadium security guard could have neutralized the situation. For Austin's father, the first and most vital line of defense that failed his son was the lack of active adult supervision within the student shelter areas during an emergency weather evacuation. Furthermore, the family's grief is compounded by the belief that school districts and athletic associations must implement stricter security protocols for large-scale interscholastic events. When hundreds of teenagers gather from various regional schools, rivalries and teenage posturing are predictable variables. Austin's father has argued that a stadium hosting such events must have clear, enforced boundaries and active monitoring, especially when weather anomalies force students into tight quarters. If school staff or security personnel had been actively patrolling the tent areas, or if there had been a structured protocol for housing visiting students separately during the delay, the friction between the two groups would never have materialized. The argument escalated simply because there was no authority figure present to say, "Step outside," or to reassign shelter. In the eyes of a father looking at the empty seat at his dinner table, the tragedy was entirely preventable through basic, proactive administrative oversight and a rigorous adherence to student safety during unexpected campus emergencies. The mechanics of a stadium during an emergency weather evacuation require precision. But on April 2, 2025, the breakdown in protocol created a vacuum that allowed conflict to thrive. David Kuykendall Stadium was packed with hundreds of student athletes, coaches, and spectators when the skies darkened over Frisco, Texas. In Texas high school track and field, severe lightning and torrential rain trigger an immediate suspension of outdoor activities. Standard operating procedures dictate that students should be systematically guided to hard shell structures, such as field houses, locker rooms, or school buses, which offer grounded lightning protection and controllable environments. Instead, as the downpour intensified, the perimeter of the track became a chaotic scramble for immediate cover. Pop-up team tents, designed for shade rather than secure shelter or crowd control, became the primary refuge for clusters of teenagers. Austin Metcalf's father has continually scrutinized this specific logistical failure, raising the critical question of why a premier athletic facility lacked a tightly enforced, centralized evacuation plan that separated rival schools and placed students under direct, immediate adult supervision. When the weather delay was officially called, the division of authority became blurred. Track meets involve multiple schools simultaneously, meaning coaches are often stretched thin, managing dozens of athletes across various field events. In the rush to secure equipment and ensure their own rosters were accounted for, adults were separated from the very spaces where the students were congregating. Austin and his twin brother Hunter were inside the Frisco Memorial High School tent, a space conceptually designated for their team. Carmelo Anthony, navigating the same blinding rain, sought refuge in the nearest available structure, which happened to be the memorial tent. For Austin's father, the administrative failure is glaring. A stadium hosting high-profile regional events must have designated security personnel or marshals assigned to patrol the shelter zones during a delay. The physical layout of the tents created blind spots for the coaching staff, who were huddled near the main field house or timing booths. This lack of visibility meant that as two distinct student groups overlapped in a highly charged atmosphere, there was no official presence to maintain order or enforce boundaries. The contrast between the prosecution and defense theories during the 2026 trial further highlights how an early administrative intervention could have saved a life. The prosecution presented a narrative of a hostile intrusion, where Anthony allegedly entered the tent with a defiant attitude, holding his hand inside his backpack, where a knife was concealed. The defense, conversely, painted a picture of a terrified, outnumbered youth seeking shelter from a storm, only to be trapped and physically assaulted by larger athletes. Austin's father looks past the legal maneuvering to the core reality. Neither scenario should have ever been allowed to manifest. Had stadium officials utilized the facility's public address system to direct specific schools to assigned, secure indoor areas, Anthony would have been guided to a Centennial High School zone, and the Metcalf brothers would have remained secure within a Memorial High School zone. The tragedy did not begin when the knife was drawn. It began when the structural protocols of the event allowed a volatile, unmonitored intersection of students to occur in a dark, rain-soaked tent while the adults responsible for their safety were elsewhere. The escalation from a verbal dispute to a fatal encounter inside that dark, rain-soaked tent took less than 2 minutes, a window of time that Austin Metcalf's father views as the ultimate missed opportunity for intervention. According to witness testimony brought forth during the June 2026 murder trial in Collin County, the confrontation began the moment Carmelo Anthony stepped inside the Frisco Memorial High School team tent. Austin and his twin brother Hunter immediately demanded that Anthony leave, asserting ownership over their team's designated space. Anthony refused, and the text of the trial discovery reveals a rapidly deteriorating verbal exchange. Onlookers testified that Anthony kept his hand hidden inside his backpack, issuing quiet but severe warnings to the athletes blocking his exit. For Austin's father, this 90-second standoff is the most agonizing sequence of the entire tragedy. It represents a brief, distinct pocket of time where the situation was highly audible and entirely volatile, yet completely invisible to the coaches and stadium staff who were only yards away, seeking shelter from the severe lightning delay. The physical disparity between the teenagers involved in the confrontation creates two starkly different interpretations of those final seconds, yet both versions underscore the absolute necessity of an adult presence. Austin Metcalf was a standout 6'1", 210-pound varsity football player, built for physical contact and accustomed to commanding space. Carmelo Anthony stood at 5'8" and weighed roughly 130 pounds. When the verbal argument peaked, Austin moved forward to physically evict Anthony from the tent, either grabbing or pushing the smaller youth. The defense argued that this physical contact triggered an overwhelming survival instinct in Anthony, who felt trapped and outnumbered by larger athletes. The prosecution maintained that Anthony was looking for a reason to use the weapon he had already prepared. Austin's father, looking at the hard data of the case, has pointed out that a teenager's brain under pressure is driven by adrenaline, posturing, and peer perception. Neither Austin nor Anthony was equipped with the emotional maturity to de-escalate a territorial dispute in front of an audience of their peers. The presence of a single authority figure would have completely broken the psychological spell of the confrontation, forcing both sides to step back before a physical line was crossed. The ultimate failure, as defined by the Metcalf family, lies in the reliance on teenagers to self-regulate in high-stress environments. In the aftermath of the verdict, which saw Anthony sentenced to 35 years in prison, Austin's father emphasized that the responsibility for safety can never be outsourced to the students themselves. When the rain began to pour and the track meet was suspended, the stadium became a collection of unmonitored micro-environments. A minor dispute over a piece of nylon shelter was allowed to escalate into a first-degree murder because there was a systemic assumption that high school juniors and seniors could handle spatial conflicts on their own. The fatal single stab wound to Austin's heart was the physical cause of death, but the structural cause was the silence of the adults during those critical 2 minutes. If a coach had been patrolling the tent rows, or if stadium security had been assigned to monitor the perimeter of the field during the weather evacuation, the loud, aggressive verbal exchange would have been easily intercepted. The boys would have been separated, and Austin would have walked away to play another season. The focus of Austin Metcalf's father extends far beyond the immediate actions inside the team tent. It heavily scrutinizes the systemic vulnerabilities regarding weapons security at high school athletic venues. David Kuykendall Stadium, like many modern multi-million-dollar suburban sports complexes in Texas, boasts state-of-the-art facilities, turf fields, and extensive seating. Yet on the day of the track meet, there were no metal detectors, wand checks, or bag inspection protocols in place at the spectator or athlete entrances. Carmelo Anthony was able to walk onto the property with a folding knife concealed inside his personal backpack, a weapon that ultimately bypassed every safety layer of the Frisco Independent School District. For a grieving father, this represents a massive, predictable gap in modern campus security. In an era where schools implement strict clear bag policies for varsity football games and install advanced weapon detection systems at main building entrances, the casual nature of regular season track and field events creates a dangerous double standard in student protection. The argument for preventative security screening becomes even more critical when analyzing the logistical nature of track meets. Unlike a standard football or basketball game where spectators are confined to the stands and athletes remain on a secure court, a track meet is a sprawling, decentralized event. Hundreds of competitors from a dozen different regional schools move freely between the track, the infield, the concession stands, and the outer perimeter where team tents are pitched. The boundaries between teams, and even between athletes and the general public, are highly fluid. Austin's father has argued that this open campus layout makes centralized weapons screening not just a luxury, but an absolute necessity. If the school district had treated the entrance to the stadium with the same security rigor as a standard school day, the knife would have been intercepted at the gate. Anthony would have been disarmed. School resource officers would have been notified, and the subsequent verbal altercation in the tent would have resulted in nothing more than a heated argument rather than a fatal wounding. This demand for structural reform reflects a broader frustration with how school safety measures are prioritized and funded. Following the trial in June 2026, where the jury ultimately rejected Anthony's self-defense claims, the public conversation shifted heavily towards stadium safety mandates. Austin's father has publicly advocated for standardizing security infrastructure across all athletic departments, ensuring that off-site or multi-school competitions are held to the exact same safety standards as normal instructional hours. The defense spent the trial arguing that Anthony carried the knife for personal protection outside of school, highlighting a troubling reality regarding how common weapons have become among teenagers. By failing to police the boundary of the stadium, the administration allowed that outside reality to bleed directly into a school-sanctioned event. For the Metcalf family, the path to prevention is clear. The physical safety of an athlete cannot begin and end at the classroom door. It must extend to every field, stadium, and tent where a student represents their school. The psychological dynamic of peer pressure and teenage posturing is an invisible factor that Austin Metcalf's father believes was never properly managed on the afternoon of April 2, 2025. When severe weather halted the track meet, it did not just displace students. It forced them into highly concentrated, performance-driven environments. High school athletics are inherently built on competition, physical dominance, and school pride. When Carmelo Anthony entered the Frisco Memorial High School tent, he was not just entering a physical shelter. He was entering the sovereign territory of a rival program. For teenage boys, especially varsity athletes like Austin and his brother, defending that territory becomes an unspoken social expectation. With other student athletes watching the interaction unfold in real time, neither side felt they could back down without losing face. Austin's father has emphasized that adults must understand the intense weight of peer perception on the adolescent brain. Without an authority figure to absorb the tension and dictate a resolution, the teenagers were trapped by their own social conditioning, forcing a minor territorial dispute to escalate into a physical confrontation. This need to maintain social status before an audience of peers directly fueled the timeline of the escalation. Witness statements from the Collin County trial revealed that as the verbal argument grew louder, other students gathered around the perimeter of the tent, filming with their phones and escalating the energy of the conflict, rather than trying to diffuse it. The modern landscape of youth culture, heavily influenced by social media and instant digital status, means that every confrontation is treated as a potential public broadcast. In the view of the Metcalf family, this digital and social environment acts as an accelerant. Austin, an MVP football player, was accustomed to standing his ground and protecting his teammates. Anthony, smaller and outnumbered, felt the immediate pressure of being humiliated by larger rivals in front of a crowd. Austin's father argues that school administrators must train coaches and athletic staff to recognize these hidden social dynamics. During a weather delay, students should never be left in groups where mob mentality or competitive rivalries can take over. The lack of proactive separation allowed the toxic elements of teenage pride to dictate the outcome. The tragedy of the situation lies in the fact that both boys were playing roles defined by their environment. If a coach had stepped into the tent at the 60-second mark, the burden of posturing would have been instantly removed from both Austin and Anthony. They would have been ordered to separate, giving them a socially acceptable out from the confrontation. They could obey an adult without appearing weak to their peers. By leaving the teenagers completely to their own devices, the system failed to protect them from the worst impulses of adolescent decision-making. Austin's father has noted that the 35-year prison sentence handed down to Anthony in June 2026 is a stark reminder of what happens when the adult world abdicates its responsibility to govern these volatile social spaces. Prevention requires more than just physical walls and metal detectors. It requires an active, empathetic understanding of how teenagers interact under pressure, and a refusal to let them settle adult-level conflicts with zero adult guidance. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy shifted the focus from stadium logistics to the critical need for comprehensive medical emergency training and rapid response infrastructure at youth sporting events. When Austin Metcalf was stabbed in the chest, the clock immediately began ticking against his survival. The blade had pierced his heart, an injury requiring instantaneous, specialized surgical intervention. In those first chaotic seconds, as the pouring rain hammered against the team tent, the immediate burden of life-saving care fell entirely on the shoulders of onlookers, including Austin's twin brother, Hunter, and the high school coaching staff. Austin's father, Jeff Metcalf, has heavily emphasized that the sheer panic of that moment exposed a severe vulnerability in how athletic departments prepare for worst-case medical scenarios. While coaches are routinely certified in basic CPR and standard first aid, the reality of managing a massive penetrating trauma in the middle of a chaotic weather evacuation proved that existing emergency action plans were profoundly inadequate. For a grieving father, a critical point of prevention lies in the mandatory deployment of advanced medical personnel at any large-scale, multi-school athletic competition. A district track meet involves hundreds of student-athletes spread across a sprawling facility. Yet the medical presence is often limited to a single school nurse or a certified athletic trainer equipped primarily for orthopedic injuries like sprains or heat exhaustion. Jeff Metcalf has pointed out that if a dedicated emergency medical technician or a specialized trauma response unit had been stationed directly on the infield, the transit time to administer advanced life support would have been counted in seconds rather than minutes. In deep thoracic trauma, the accumulation of blood around the heart demands immediate decompression and advanced clotting interventions. The frantic efforts of the coaches who performed CPR on the stadium turf while awaiting municipal first responders were valiant, but ultimately unequipped to handle the physiological reality of a punctured heart. This gap in immediate trauma care is a systemic issue that the Metcalf family believes must be resolved through strict legislative mandates. Following the conclusion of the trial in June 2026, where the severe emotional trauma of the event was laid bare through body camera footage and witness testimonies, the call for Austin's Law or similar safety reforms began to gain traction. Jeff Metcalf's perspective is that every stadium operating under the authority of a school district must be treated with the same safety protocols as a professional sports arena during live events. This includes requiring visible mobile trauma kits, complete with chest seals and advanced hemostatic agents, to be stationed at multiple intervals around the facility, alongside staff specifically trained to use them under high-stress conditions. By relying solely on municipal ambulances to navigate traffic and weather to reach a stadium, the system effectively surrenders the most critical window of survival. Prevention, in its truest sense, must encompass the ability to save a life after a violent breach has occurred, ensuring that no other parent has to listen to the recorded screams of a sibling trying to stop their twin's bleeding while waiting for help that is too far away. The final element of prevention, as viewed through the gut-wrenching experience of Austin Metcalf's father, Jeff Metcalf, involves the immediate aftermath of the violence and the toxic environment that swallowed the family long before they ever set foot in the Collin County Courthouse. Preventing a tragedy does not end when the physical violence stops. It must encompass protecting the families left behind from secondary trauma and polarization. Following the fatal incident at Kuykendall Stadium, the case quickly became a flashpoint for intense social, digital, and political debate. For a family trying to process the sudden, violent loss of a son, the immediate onslaught of external narratives, online threats, and weaponized social media coverage became a secondary crisis that could have been mitigated with better structural boundaries and immediate institutional protection. Jeff Metcalf spoke directly to this overwhelming reality during his emotional victim impact statement following the June 2026 verdict. He revealed that in the wake of his son's death, the family had been subjected to targeted harassment, including being swatted 6 separate times, a highly dangerous hoax where emergency services are falsely dispatched to a residence under the pretense of an active critical incident.
This morning, yesterday, had a death threat. This morning, had multiple emails, text, threatening me, calling me all sorts of names.
Digital communities and outside activists frequently swoop in to exploit the grief, turning a tragic loss of life into a broader cultural battlefield. Prevention, from the father's perspective, must include robust legal and digital safeguards that shield grieving families from being targeted by bad actors who use real-world trauma to fuel online engagement. The outside noise threatened to distort the true focus of the case, which Jeff Metcalf repeatedly insisted was strictly about right and wrong, rather than the societal divisions being projected onto it by commentators and activists. The family found themselves forced to defend the character of Austin and his twin brother Hunter against online narratives that attempted to mischaracterize the boys as bullies to justify the violence. This public defense added an unimaginable layer of exhaustion to an already broken family. Jeff Metcalf noted that the tragedy essentially destroyed the person he used to be, creating a permanent void that could never be filled by a courtroom verdict. True prevention requires a cultural and institutional shift where the primary dignity of the victim and the privacy of the grieving family are aggressively protected from the moment a crisis occurs, ensuring that the legal process can unfold with focus, security, and basic human decency. The legacy of Austin Metcalf's short life and the devastating manner of his passing ultimately serves as a stark, unavoidable blueprint for institutional reform. For his father, Jeff Metcalf, the journey through the halls of David Kuykendall Stadium to the witness stand of the Collin County Courthouse has been a painful lesson in the cost of systemic complacency. The 35-year prison sentence delivered to Carmelo Anthony on June 9, 2026, closed the legal chapter of this tragedy, but it did nothing to dim the reality that Austin should still be here. The fatal confrontation was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was a predictable human crisis allowed to happen within a sequence of administrative, security, and medical blind spots. By identifying the exact points where the system failed to protect 2 groups of teenagers during a routine weather delay, the Metcalf family has provided school districts across the country with a clear, urgent mandate to change how youth sports are supervised and secured. Prevention in its truest form requires a cultural shift that treats the safety of student-athletes with the same rigorous standard inside an arena as it does inside a classroom. It demands that school administrations eliminate the double standards of security screening, ensuring that open campus athletic events are protected by proactive weapon detection and strict perimeter controls. It mandates that emergency action plans evolve past basic first aid checklists to include advanced trauma infrastructure and rapid response medical personnel stationed directly on the field. Most importantly, it requires an honest acknowledgement from the adult world that teenagers cannot be left to navigate high-stakes, territorial conflicts under the intense pressure of peer observation without active, visible supervision. If school districts implement these structural overhauls, treating every tent, field, and stadium as a fully monitored sanctuary for their students, then Austin's death will not just remain a tragic statistic of suburban violence. Instead, his memory will be permanently woven into a safer, more accountable environment for every young athlete who steps onto a field under a darkening sky.